Good morning and welcome to this inaugural strategic talk. My name is Mats Engman and I'm the head of the Korea Center here at ISDP in Stockholm. This strategic talks is an effort to further promote dialogue and exchange of views related to the development on the Korea Peninsula and in the region. The overall aim of this new initiative is to further increase the understanding of the many factors and policies that impact security developments, and we intend to do this by inviting prominent scholars and experts from different backgrounds and nations to a friendly conversation during 1 hour. The conversation would typically include 2 experts, and we will strive to have a series of conversations within a rather short time span, covering the same issues, but from different perspectives. This would, we hope, enable us to identify possible differences in understanding, assessments, and policies. The strategic talks will be public and recorded, normally not including a Q&A part, but please feel free to make comments about the talk using the chat function on the screen. Occasionally, we would also summarize a strategic talk or a strategic talks series into a publication. So, in this first series of strategic talks, we will conduct 3 sessions during the month of June. 1 today with 2 European experts, 1 on the 19th of June with 2 US experts, and 1 on the day after on the 20th with 2 South Korean experts, all talking about the very same issues. But over to today's talks. So I'm very excited for this inaugural talk to have 2 true European experts joining me, Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo and Dr. John Nilsson Wright. You are most welcome, both of you, and of course, all our viewers today. I will now give a short introduction of our 2 speakers before we carry on. Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo is Professor of International Relations at King's College in London, head of the Department of European and International Studies, the KFVUB Korea Chair at the Brussels School of Governance of Vrije University, Brussels, and King's College London's Regional Envoy for East and Southeast Asia. Beside his focus on international relations, his research lies in security and political economy of the Korean Peninsula, East Asia, and the Indo-Pacific, as well as relations between Europe and the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. Among his many published books are, for example, South Korean Grand Strategy, Making Its Own Destiny, and North Korea-US Relations from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. Dr. John Nilsson Wright is an associate professor at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge and an official fellow at Darwin College. He was head of the Chatham House Asia program from 2014 to 16, and he is a non-resident fellow at the Sejong University in Seoul, South Korea, and a visiting senior fellow at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Nilsson Wright's work concentrates on the Cold War relationship between the United States and Northeast Asia, with reference to the security and political relationships between the United States, Japan, and the 2 Koreas, and contemporary regional security issues and political change, including the changing nature of alliance relations in East Asia. Among his many publications are The Politics and International Relations of Modern Korea and Yoon's Vision for South Korea as a Global Pivotal State. Is there anything to it? I've asked Ramon and John to give a very short introduction to get our conversation going. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ramon. Please, Ramon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mats, for this invitation. And thanks to ISDP for your collaboration throughout the years as well. I'm going to start with a short introduction, as you mentioned, of one development that we are seeing in the Korean Peninsula, which is the growing links between, on the one hand, the DPRK and Russia, which obviously directly affects us here in Europe, and then the growing links, on the other hand, between the ROK, the US, Japan, and other countries in Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific. So to start with the first point that I just mentioned, this strengthening ties between the DPRK and Russia. For me, this is a fairly important development in the DPRK's foreign policy and security ties with third parties, because what we are seeing here is that traditionally in the relationship between Russia and North Korea, it was North Korea that was the supplicant, so to speak, to Russia. It was Russia that had the technology, the oil, the food, the expertise that North Korea needed. But potentially for the first time in the history of the bilateral relationship, we are seeing North Korea having the upper hand and Russia not necessarily being the supplicant, but certainly being the country that needs the most from the partner. So what we are seeing is that North Korea has been able to extract very significant concessions from Russia. I think by now there is solid evidence that Russian experts have gone to North Korea to support the development of his missile program, of his satellite program, ultimately of his nuclear program. We have seen energy resources being transferred from Russia to North Korea, but we have also seen solid evidence that Russia is also transferring materials that North Korea can use in the development of his missile program and other programs as well. And what we see here is that, in my view, as long as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, and therefore, in this case, President Putin needs the support that he's getting from North Korea, I think that Pyongyang is going to continue to have the upper hand, which puts North Korea in a very strong position within the Korean Peninsula, because it knows it's going to count with the economic support, with the diplomatic support as well, of course, in the UN Security Council from Russia. And it also means that potentially North Korea could go back to the game that it played during the Cold War, in which when it was playing Russia or the Soviet Union back then against China. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that here. I would add a couple of points about this relationship between Russia and North Korea. I do see it with those who don't think that this means that there's going to be a formal alliance like we have, for example, between South Korea and the US. I think this is a marriage of convenience for the time being. And related to this, I don't think that we're moving towards a formal relationship between the two of them, China, potentially other countries as well, such as Iran. Clearly, there are links and ties between the four of them, other countries as well, other groups, for example. Hamas seems to have some links also to this group, but I don't think we're moving into formal territory, a formal relationship between the four of them, or even, as I said, between the three of them when we talk about China as well, or the two of them we focus on Russia and North Korea. On the other hand, looking at the South, looking at the ROK, looking at South Korea, I think the situation is different. It is different because I think it is a strengthening ties. Obviously, with the US, the alliance will continue. I think regardless of who wins the election, there may be some turbulence, of course, if Trump goes back to office, but we saw the alliance survive the first Trump administration. Obviously, with President Biden, the relationship between the US and South Korea has solidified even further. But I want to talk about the other countries, which with South Korea is boosting its security ties. Clearly with Japan, we have seen recently a trilateral summit in which the three countries have agreed to actually formalize the relationship potentially through the launch of a structure that would mean that it will survive a change in government in any of the three countries. In the US, potentially in November. President Yoon, of course, still has almost 3 years to go in office, and in the case of Japan, we'll see when elections finally take place. But they're trying to solidify this relationship so that it survives the current iteration of the three leaders who seem to get along quite well. Interestingly, I think that South Korea and Japan are also trying to move towards a more mature relationship in which they separate historical issues from the benefits that both of them see from security cooperation when facing the challenges coming from North Korea, from China. Now both of them mostly feel a challenge from Russia as well. So there's this trilateral framework, but also the bilateral relationship, I think, that trying to move ahead with it as well. But I wanted to expand this because I think something that the current South Korean president, he's not the first one, but clearly he's pushing this very openly. What he's trying to do is to boost ties with other countries as well. So we have seen South Korea openly saying that it would be very happy to cooperate with the AUKUS countries in their second pillar, not potentially formally joining the second pillar, because this seems to have been ruled out by Australia, the US, and the UK, but certainly cooperating with them the development of new technologies. We have seen the relationship between South Korea and Australia really strengthening in recent years with the 2+2 dialogue that they maintain at the highest level, but on top of that with arms transfers or arms sales from South Korea to Australia, and talk about further security ties between the two of them. And sitting here in Europe, of course, we have the burgeoning relationship with NATO through the NATO AP4 framework, but also through the bilateral ITPP between NATO and Korea in areas, for example, such as cybersecurity, non-proliferation, South Korea also learning from how the NATO nuclear umbrella works, or for example, the development of new weapon systems. And of course, within Europe, we also see stronger ties with countries such as Poland, for example. So to finish my initial presentation, I think what South Korea is trying to do here is trying to hedge its bets. Obviously, the alliance with the US is going to continue to be the fundamental pillar of South Korea's security partnerships, but we have seen a diversification of ties, which in my view has to do with the growing threat that South Korea feels not only from North Korea, but also from countries such as China, but also going back to the Trump presidency, the fear that South Koreans have that relations could weaken with the US. The alliance won't break up if Trump returns to office, but relations can weaken if Trump returns to office from next January, and therefore South Korea is hedging its bets and trying to boost ties with other countries as well. And I will leave it there for my initial remarks, and look forward to the discussion later on after we hear John also with his initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Ramon, for highlighting these two really important developments related to the regime we are talking about. So please, John, over to you in Cambridge.
Mats, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to you personally and to ISDP. And it's a pleasure, as always, to share public space with Ramon, who I think has very expertly set out some of the structural factors, which I broadly agree with. I think when we look at the situation at the moment, we see North Korea quite opportunistically, I think, trying to develop this relationship with Russia. And of course, President Putin, who we expect will be visiting Pyongyang at some point in the near future, has similarly a series, I think, of personal motivations why it makes sense to strengthen that security cooperation. But this is short of a formal alliance relationship. One thing I would stress, I think, now, and when we think about the security challenge that North Korea represents, is how much more extensive it is. While North Korea has, of course, had ties with the Middle East in the past, its technological sophistication, evidence that it has provided missile technology to Iran that facilitated Iran's attack on Israel, and of course support for Hamas, whether it's in the form of glider technology or drone technology, which may have facilitated the October 7th intervention, is a reminder of why North Korea continues to be a real and present danger, not just in Northeast Asia, but further afield. We might want to come back to the question of Russia's ties with South Korea and the extent to which there are material economic reasons why, from Moscow's perspective, maintaining that relationship, notwithstanding all of the concerns about North Korea, still remains important. On the issue, I think, of President Yoon's foreign policy, Ramon, who of course has written extensively about the strategic focus of South Korea, I think reminds us of how now South Korea is really a foreign policy and strategic innovator. That's not exclusively down to President Yoon. We've seen previous attempts by progressive presidents to define South Korea's foreign policy posture in this respect. But I think we have seen, perhaps on the back of some of the disappointments that the Conservative administration has had in the wake of the National Assembly elections, a renewed appetite to engage with foreign affairs. And I think this represents a real sign of the innovative quality of South Korea's foreign policy with Europe and also with countries that share its interest in regional stability in the Indo-Pacific. Just to mention one obvious country that has a role in this context, the United Kingdom. We saw the state visit of President Yoon to the United Kingdom last year, the establishment of the so-called Downing Street Accord, which I think is a very important affirmation of the many different areas in which European countries, and I count the UK, even post-Brexit, as a European country, have an interest in strengthening that cooperation. So all of this, I think, is an encouraging sign of greater cooperation to deal with those immediate security concerns and wider issues. This question of hedging, the question of the big, if you like, political elephant in the room, what happens in November, which I'm sure we'll want to come back to, raises really interesting questions about what can be done. Despite all of this effort, how well prepared is a country like South Korea, which of course depends so critically on the United States for its alliance partnership? How best can they guard against the potential risk of a very transformative potential Trump 2 presidency, given all of the evidence we've seen so far from former President Trump in terms of what he thinks about the strategic relationship? I'd like, however, just briefly, if I may, to bring us back to recent events and to sort of move away from the high-level structural issues to think about the question of risk. Because, of course, it's one of the perennial issues we face when looking at North Korea, which is how close are we to a potential security crisis on the peninsula? And we've seen in the last few days and weeks a ratcheting up of tension between North and South Korea, the launching of over 1,000 balloons from North Korea into South Korea is seen as a real provocation, and it raises interesting questions. What's behind this? Why has the North been engaging in what seems, I think, to outside observers as a rather kind of anodyne set of exercises? Part of this may be prompted by the recent trilateral summit that took place just a few days ago in Seoul between China, Japan, and of course South Korea, the first time in 4.5 years that these three countries have come together. And one of the key issues in that very important symbolic and practical renewed cooperation between those three countries was the question of stability on the Korean Peninsula. It may well be that the North Koreans are concerned about the optics, if you like, of China engaging in dialogue with Japan and South Korea about broader security issues. The Chinese, for their part, have been very careful not to be overly closely identified with Japan and South Korea in sending signals to the North Koreans, but their very presence in that dialogue has been a source of concern. The other issue, of course, which again was associated with that very important summit, was North Korea's decision to attempt abortively to launch a second satellite. And of course, that has been a source of real concern, condemnation from the United States and its allies. And the technical failure of that launch raises renewed questions about what North Korea might do in the immediate future. It's made a clear commitment that it wants to continue to test 3 more satellites in the course of this coming year. And there are real doubts about how well prepared North Korea is to develop its technical capacity in that critical area. Technical capacity which may be, as Ramon was suggesting, being provided by Russia. In all of this, and again, just to sort of emphasize the importance of escalation, we've seen very strong language coming out of Seoul. The decision by the South Korean cabinet to cancel the so-called September 19th agreement that provides military assurance, agreed to in 2018 by the former progressive administration of South Korea. That, Mats, as you well know, given your own extensive experience in monitoring security preparedness on the Korean Peninsula, in turn, the removal of that agreement raises questions about the risk of escalation. And I think the nervousness on both sides, the danger of the standoff between the two countries leading to more potential encounters, both at land and importantly at sea, and we might want to come back to this, the so-called Western Sea area, contested areas. All of this, I think, raises interesting questions about how best to provide reassurance and to minimize the risk of escalation at a time when, of course, the United States is preoccupied not only with security on the Korean Peninsula, but security further afield in the East China Sea, very importantly in the South China Sea. We've just seen the election of a new president in Taiwan, as well as, of course, those broader issues in Europe, and let's not forget the Middle East. So the North Korean issue, I would emphasize, is important, not only because of the long-standing standoffs between the two Koreas, but of course, this more vulnerable security environment that the world is facing at the moment. But I'll leave my remarks there and look forward to more discussion.
Thank you very much, John. And Ramon, you have, if we talk Gulf language, you have teed up a lot of very interesting issues that we can engage in for discussion. I would like us to start with staying a little bit focused on this about maybe the start of an emerging security architecture in this part of the world, where you both have talked about the let's say the trilateral alliance, and maybe a little bit more extended when we add Quad and AUKUS, we engage India and Australia and possibly also other nations on the one side, and then we have DPRK, Russia relations, and it seems, at least from where I sit, that China is quietly accepting this relationship, and maybe even including Iran and some others. So are we seeing a slowly emerging kind of security architecture? And this is a security architecture that is not a common security architecture. It's more like a Cold War type of two blocks. One, let's say, democratic, one more authoritarian bloc. And what would that kind of imply for looking forward when it comes to the inter-Korean relation and addressing the key problem here, North Korea's kind of, as you put it, John, a more extended threat, not only to the region, but to other parts of the world. So are we seeing, and what would be the consequences, is my two first questions. So maybe over to you, Ramon, first.
Yes, thanks for that. I don't think we are moving towards a Cold War style relationship among powers in Asia or Indo-Pacific. China is too central from an economic point of view for countries in the region to try to isolate it. Even in diplomatic terms, I don't see any appetite, including in South Korea, to withhold talks with China. And now on the security front, I think that's a very interesting point that you raise. China, of course, is accusing the US of trying to create a NATO-style organization in the region. I think we're very far away from that type of organization, and Mats would know better than any of us. But it is true that we're seeing a growing number of minilaterals led by the US. We have AUKUS that has been mentioned before. We have a trilateral in Northeast Asia. Some people are calling the Camp David trilateral, right, with Korea and with Japan. Now there is talk about another quadrilateral, including the Philippines, Australia, and Japan, together with the US, and I was in Seoul a couple of weeks ago. There was some discussion about whether Korea could actually work with these countries, because it actually cooperates with all of them on a bilateral basis, including with the Philippines, right? So for example, Korea regularly sends its soldiers to the Philippines for joint exercises or training, right? So we're seeing these different minilaterals. I'm a bit less certain about the Quad, to be completely honest. My impression from discussions in the region is that the Quad has lost a lot of steam, among other reasons, because the countries that are part of the Quad, India especially, has a different position on issues such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which obviously creates political frictions. But also seems that other minilaterals have very clear goals, and from a security perspective, they have really been able to move forward the partnership between the different countries. With AUKUS, this is very clear, but the trilateral between the US, Korea, and Japan as well. We have seen multiple exercises, intelligence sharing, information sharing as well, right? And this is something that we're not necessarily seeing in the Quad, right? I also should add that I found very interesting that very recently, Secretary of Defense Austin, I think it was over the weekend, he was also talking about the US leading on setting the rules of the game for the development of new technologies, right? And apparently has been accepted, military technologies, and apparently has been accepted by different countries in the region too. So without the emergence of two blocks, in my point of view, is that this is not going to happen, but we are seeing more and more countries cooperating with the US. And what I found interesting is that some countries are more vocal about this. Clearly, Japan and Australia have been for a long time. Korea now more recently as well has been more vocal about this. But even in Southeast Asia, in private, you do see when you talk to officials in the region that they see the limits in terms of security cooperation with China, and they see the benefits of working together with the US, right? And they won't say this publicly because they don't want to antagonize China, and I completely understand this. And they're not going to do this from an economic or diplomatic point of view, but when it comes to security, with the exception now of Philippines more recently, which has been very open about it, but other countries in the region talking about the merits of having a US presence, cooperating with the US. Obviously, Singapore is doing this. Other countries are thinking about doing so as well. So I don't think we'll see the emergence of two blocks, but I will see more and more countries balancing China with the support of the US, whether it's on a bilateral basis and quietly, or on a bilateral or multilateral basis and more openly. And I personally think that this is happening. The big question is the one that John mentioned previously. What will happen if Trump comes to office? Is this going to continue or not? But I'll leave it there, and then we can discuss maybe US election later.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, John. Do you see the emergence of a call it a security architecture, an alliance system, or an alliance light system, something similar emerging in the region?
I think I would echo what Ramon is saying. There's no doubt that when it comes to the US, South Korea, and Japan, the Camp David Agreement and all the things we've seen just over the last few days is a reminder how concerned the Biden administration has been to not only consolidate its existing alliance ties, those two parts, if you like, of the hub and spokes model that we had during the Cold War, the bilateral security relationship between the US and South Korea and the US and Japan, precisely because opinion in both countries is concerned about the possibility of a Trump victory and US disengagement. But also, and then this is really consistent throughout the entire term of the Biden presidency, to try and move beyond that, to put in place a virtual trilateral alliance, if you like. And I don't think we can minimize how important the recent developments have been. We've had an announcement at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore just a few days ago of new joint exercises between South Korea, Japan, and the United States. It's going to be labeled Freedom Edge. That's, I think, really important because it will involve cooperation in terms of air, land, underwater, and for the first time, cyber cooperation between the three countries. So I think one shouldn't minimize the significance of this. I mean, it really does represent a major development, and one has to also, I think, commend President Yoon for taking really big risks in embracing this strategy, because, of course, as I'm sure our listeners know, there's a great deal of polarization in South Korean politics about the question of cooperation with Japan. On top of that, we've had efforts to reassure South Korean political and public opinion by the establishment of a nuclear consultative agreement. These are all attempts, if you like, to bolster alliance cooperation. But Ramon is absolutely right. Neither South Korea nor Japan wants to be trapped in a binary choice between the United States and China. And for the Biden administration's point of view, that binary choice is also something to avoid. If you think back to the publication in the autumn of 2022 of the United States National Security document, there was talk of both cooperation with democratic partners, but also, where necessary, with non-like-minded partners. And that includes China, of course, because of all sorts of critical issues to do with environment and other concerns. Bilaterally, we see South Korea and Japan strengthening their cooperation with China. President Yoon, has called upon China to act as a bastion of peace, in his words. There has been a very significant decision to establish a 2+2 defense and foreign ministers dialogue with China. And that's designed, I think, to break out of this binary discourse. Japan, for its part, recently has been reinforcing its commitment to economic engagement with China. We had a recent visit by the Chinese head of the Chinese Communist Party to Japan to talk about cooperation between political actors in both countries, precisely as a way of minimizing some of these tensions. And I think it's worth being reminded of the metaphor that the Biden administration used, I think, quite effectively in thinking about regional security, broadly defined, which is this idea of a lattice work. Multilateral, minilateral, bilateral mechanisms of cooperation, issue-specific, designed to increase cooperation. And I think all of this is designed to do two things: to establish continuity in some of these existing relationships, but also to create a climate of reassurance and trust, not just between like-minded countries, but with other actors. So I think we should welcome this diversity of initiatives and the attempt to ensure that there is a coordinated, holistic approach to thinking about regional security, but it needs to be tailored to specific issues. And all of the actors that we've just been mentioning, I think, recognize the importance of this. Part of it is also driven by simple resource constraints. The United States can no longer afford to be the exclusive, even if it remains the principal guarantor of regional stability. And that's why we're seeing, quite, I think, understandably, the US looking to encourage other countries like South Korea and Japan to do more where they can. And that's to be welcomed.
Thank you, John. I listen to both you and Ramon. I mean, I get a kind of reflection back to our own continent's history with this kind of multi-layered, multi-institutional security framework existed, where we had WEU, we had NATO, we had the Organization for Security Cooperation, we had EU. So we had a multitude of different and occasionally these could complement each other. So maybe that's not a very good idea, very bad idea to have this kind of diversity. I would like to spend a little bit more time on this and addressing two specific questions. The first one is more looking domestically to South Korea. You've mentioned in your two presentations and interventions the recent assembly election in South Korea, where you still have a majority for the opposition. And my question is, can we envisage and see that the foreign policy area could be an area where the Yoon administration could, strike bargains with the assembly, and we had a more bipartisan foreign policy, because there are some contentious issues on foreign policy in the South Korean domestic debate. The relation with Japan is, of course, one, but also the nuclear issue is one. So that's one, a more bipartisan, foreign policy in South Korea. And my second one is looking outside externally, and where we come from, Europe. What do you see would be a potential role for Europe or the European Union in all this, to be what kind of contributions effectively could the European Union do, and maybe also extend it to NATO. So that's the two. Bipartisan foreign policy, more likely, and the European role, both EU and NATO. So over to you again, Ramon.
Thank you. I'll start maybe with the second one. Then, since I've written more about it and work more on it, I think that both NATO and the EU, also of course different European countries, is good that John mentioned in detail the UK, which has been very proactive in the region. They do see the benefits of cooperation with Korea, and I think this matters because in the past it was unclear to many in Europe, why would you cooperate with countries in Asia really, but with Korea specifically. And I think we have moved beyond that mentality here in Europe, and now we see the benefits of working together with countries in the region. Sitting in Brussels, what I find very interesting is that Korea and Japan are really top of the agenda when it comes to security cooperation, right? There is this push, as you probably know, to sign a security and defense partnership with each of them, which may happen in the coming weeks or months. And this document would actually set the guidelines, so to speak, and the principles for a stronger security ties, which in a sense is a reflection of what is already happening. You see more cooperation areas such as cyber. Again, it's good that John mentioned it before in the context of trilateral exercises between the US, Korea, and Japan, because this cyber security cooperation between the EU and Korea, between NATO and Korea, between specific European countries and Korea, such as the Netherlands, for example, was really a pioneer at the European level in cyber security ties with Korea, is really moving ahead very rapidly. If we look at the development of new weapon systems, there's discussion obviously between Poland and Korea as well. As part of the NATO ITPP framework, this could happen too, right? NATO-Korea cooperation in this area as well. And of course, both of us mentioned AUKUS before, and the UK is obviously one of the three partners. So I do think that there is more cooperation taking place. What I'm a bit more skeptical is about the role of Europe playing a role. Europe playing a substantial role at this point in time in dealing with inter-Korean tensions. I find it difficult at this point, not only because obviously inter-Korean relations are in an nadir at this moment, as John rightly described earlier, but also because I think during the 2018 diplomatic blitz that we saw between the two Koreas, between the US and North Korea, we saw that the EU, Europe, countries such as Sweden, for example, can play a role, but it's more secondary, right? The main players are going to be really the two Koreas, the US and China as well. Now, having said that, Europe can play a role, for example, in convening meetings, between the different countries that are that are involved in these tensions in the Korean Peninsula, around the Korean Peninsula. It can also send messages. Once European embassies start to return to Pyongyang, of course, there's going to be this diplomatic presence that South Korea doesn't have, the US doesn't have. It's represented by Sweden, as we all know, right? So this role is important. But if at any point in the future we see that inter-Korean dialogue resumes, or if US-North Korea dialogue resumes, I think Europe will once again become a bit more secondary, playing a role, but not the main role when it comes to these matters. On the other issue that you ask about, I think I agree with what John said, right? The fact that the Conservative Party lost the election in June, basically his domestic political agenda is going to be very difficult for him to move it forward, means that he's going to focus more on foreign affairs. I've always maintained that, yes, there are differences between liberals and conservatives in Korea, but I don't like exaggerating them. I think there are certain ideas that they all agree with. Like, for example, we don't see a conservative or liberal president, it doesn't matter who they are, who thinks that South Korea shouldn't sit down and talk to China, right? Hence the 2+2 that John rightly mentioned before, right? Conservative leaders think they need to talk to China, and you could argue the peak in China-South Korea relations was really under President Park, when we have the FTA being signed between the two countries and President Park attending the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Beijing, right? The only leader of one of the biggest democracies in the world attending such a commemoration, right? So I say this because we shouldn't exaggerate the differences. Now, when it comes to Japan, clearly President Moon and Prime Minister Abe, clearly they didn't get along. I mean, that's quite obvious, right? But it has to be said that once the two of them realize the benefits of cooperation much more quietly than Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon, but there was cooperation taking place, not to the same level as we see today, of course, right? And there were political problems between both of them, and obviously economic issues as well. But there was cooperation taking place, even if more quietly. I say this because I think once President Yoon finishes his 5-year non-renewable mandate, we don't know who will be in office, whether it will be a conservative or a liberal president, but I would expect cooperation with Japan to continue. We don't know if as open as it is now, right? And led by the president of South Korea himself. But I do think that cooperation will continue. And I think this is partly due to what we have already mentioned, the common threats that both Korea and Japan feel, coming from North Korea, from China, from Russia, potentially from a more disengaged US in the region as well. We have mentioned President Trump several times, but also I do think that they see the benefits of cooperation. And the last point I want to make is something that John mentioned, I think is very important. Resources are limited. Resources are limited. So Korea and Japan see the benefits of cooperating with the two of them trilaterally with the US and with other partners, such as AUKUS, for example, because this helps to mitigate the resource constraints that all countries are facing, right? And we shouldn't forget about this, because I think moving forward, this is going to become ever more important, how they have to share resources, because there is no other choice, so to speak, right? At some point in time, financial resources, human resources are limited. You have to see who you can work with. And in Northeast Asia, for Korea, the obvious partner is Japan.
Thank you, Ramon. Over to you, John. These two questions about the potential for a more, bipartisan foreign policy agenda in South Korea, and a potential role for Europe, the European Union, individual countries, and NATO. Thank you.
So again, I'm going to agree with Ramon that when it comes to in South Korea, there's no doubt that there is a sort of middle ground in thinking about foreign policy. And this idea of South Korea as a pivotal actor is, I think, exemplified by the way in which presidents of either conservative or progressive stripe seek to maximize their interests and opportunities for dialogue with both China and the United States. But there is, I think, also an emotional component to the way politics is practiced. And that's pretty much concentrated in some of the personalities involved. And in this, I would include both President Yoon and the leader of the Democratic Party, the main opposition party, Lee Jae-myung. Because we saw, for example, in the election campaign, in which foreign policy was largely absent, but not entirely, a willingness on the part of some politicians, Lee included, to make some really quite extraordinary foreign policy statements. So Lee Jae-myung came out and said, on the issue of Taiwan, South Korea has no interest, should have no interest. We don't care about the security situation as it relates to Taiwan. And if you think about it, that's quite an extraordinary statement. Having said that, this was an election which I think it's probably fair to say, from the point of view of the South Korean electorate, was very much focused on domestic economic issues, principally the question of inflation. There was a dispute over the question of changing the rules governing young doctors and their training and qualification. But these were sort of bread and butter issues for the electorate. And it was, of course, a very closely fought election. There was, however, one other issue that mattered, I think, to voters, which is the perception of fairness and concerns about allegations that the president's party, the president's office, was involved in efforts to perhaps restrict information. South Koreans really care about their democratic political rights, and anything that might compromise those could be seen as problematic. A footnote on this issue, which I think is worth mentioning, when it comes to the ROK-Japan relationship, there's no doubt that the real progress that's been achieved recently, I think, should be celebrated. But it doesn't stop politicians from trying to exploit this. Just recently, we had the leader of a new party, the Rebuild Korea Party, headed by Cho Guk, former justice minister from the previous progressive administration, a controversial figure in his own right, travel to the South Korean territory of Dokdo, which is claimed by Japan, otherwise known as Takeshima, to engage in something of a, I suppose, what critics might regard as a bit of a political stunt, to highlight in Cho Guk's kind of characterization, the illegitimacy of Japan's claim to this territory. And he characterized President Yoon's approach to Japan as an act of submission, hoping, I think, to stoke up public support for the Progressive Party, which now has the majority in the National Assembly. So the uncertainty here is that these tensions between left and right, notwithstanding the strength of the Progressive Party in the National Assembly, may come out in a more emotional and polarizing discourse over foreign policy. To what extent will that compromise President Yoon or make him think twice about engagement in the ways that we've seen with Japan? I don't think it's likely to make much difference, because as a one-term president, without the opportunity to seek re-election, he can, I think, relatively safely continue to pursue this line of pragmatic engagement with countries like Japan. But it only takes, if you like, another incident or a sense of vulnerability to open up that discourse for further political exploitation. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that on the other side of the bilateral relationship with Japan, Prime Minister Kishida is languishing in the polls at around about 18%. His own party support is just a little bit higher. He's just lost a major gubernatorial election. There is a real question mark about whether he will be able to stay on as prime minister. He hopes to be re-elected in September as president of the governing Liberal Democratic Party. But depending on who you speak to in Tokyo, there are some members of the Liberal Democratic Party who think that he will need to resign. Prime Minister Kishida himself is committed to staying on. If he is able to survive, we might see a general election, perhaps as soon as the autumn of this year in Japan, which might open the door for some more of these sort of emotional issues. So I don't think we can minimize the extent to which these concerns sometimes intrude into what should be sensible and pragmatic foreign policy making. On the second question of Europe's role, I agree with Ramon that it's hard to see in the current climate much that European actors can do. It would depend on the bigger players, if you like, seizing the nettle and deciding that they need to do something significant to try and move the current impasse between the two Koreas forward. And for that, as has so often been the case, responsibility really lies with Washington and to a lesser extent with Seoul. The Biden administration has, of course, pursued a policy of maintaining, if you like, the status quo, which makes sense given the pressing set of other foreign policy agenda issues. The real question is to what extent, and we come back to this question of risk, decision makers in Washington might feel that they have little choice but to try and do something significant to move bilateral relations forward. We've had former North Korea hands, Bob Gallucci, for example, who was very active in the 1990s in talks with North Korea, saying it's really a question of when rather than if the United States opens up substantive discussions with North Korea, because we need to find a way of getting Kim Jong-un to recognize the importance of dialogue. In the current climate, however, there's no real motive for him to do that. 6 months out from an election, it makes more sense for him, I think, to play a waiting game. So we're unlikely to see much progress before the election. But post-November, whoever wins, whether it's Trump or Biden, I think there will be renewed pressure and renewed interest in thinking about a new approach to North Korea. And depending on what that looks like, that may open up more space for European actors to think about familiar issues of engagement. And in this context, I think it's countries like Sweden and the Scandinavian countries in general, which have a good track record of dialogue with the North, as well as the UK, which has had now something in regions of 24 years of bilateral relations with North Korea, to think about what they can do in a supplemental role. But I think, just to kind of reiterate, the initiative needs to come from the bigger players.
Thank you, John. Time is flying when we have fun and have very interesting discussion. There is one issue that I think we need to spend some time on, and always when we talk about the Korean Peninsula and the region, we always tend to venture into the issue of risks. Risks that something goes wrong, risk for a major conflict because of the differences, the arms buildup, the recent thing that some of you mentioned about a ratcheted up tension, provocations, be it along the West Sea and Northern Limit Line, be it balloons flying over the border, etc., etc. So, and also I read an interview recently by Moon Chung-in, the former presidential advisor, about that North Korea diplomacy is, I quote, in ruins at the moment. And there is, as I understand, there is very, very limited in-person contact with North Korean officials at the moment, and has been so for a long period of time. So our fidelity on understanding North Korean thinking and decision-making is maybe worse now than it was before the pandemic. So two questions basically, or reflections on this. What immediate or what potential risks do you see for some kind of heated development on the peninsula, and what potentially policy recommendation could you envisage in order to reduce those risks? Because if we have these risks, how can we kind of mitigate or reduce the risks within the current climate, of course? So those two very easy questions. And maybe if you go first this time, John?
Thanks, Matt. Okay. Well, to strike an optimistic note, there has been a lot of speculation that North Korea is preparing for war. And you may recall there was a recent article by Bob Cullen and Secret Hacker that suggested just a few months ago that we were in a security situation that was tantamount to the months leading up to 1950, the beginning of the Korean War. I would like to believe that that's not quite the case. And the circumstantial evidence, the fact that North Korea is providing considerable amounts of munitions to Russia to support its war in Ukraine, does seem prima facie to suggest that this would not be a wise move to do if you were getting ready to attack South Korea. A premeditated attack doesn't seem plausible, and the North Koreans are rational, and they would know that this would invite full and swift and catastrophic retaliation from the US and its allies. And of course, all the efforts to shore up those security partnerships with South Korea and Japan, the Nuclear Consultative Agreement and others, are designed specifically to strengthen deterrence. The problem is the risk of conflict through miscalculation. It is in Kim Jong-un's interest to present himself as a confident, assertive military leader. The fact that there is a humanitarian crisis in North Korea may mean that he feels compelled to do that in order to demonstrate to his own public and people close to him that he is confident. And we've seen a lot of the public demonstrations of that martial mentality, if you like, and that confident, assertive posturing. We've seen recent statements by the North Korean military, particularly focusing on the northern limit line, the West Sea. I think that's striking. The fact that the formal communications have been suspended, the hotline is no longer operative between North and South Korea. If one thinks about practical solutions, something as simple but significant as a means of picking up the phone and talking to one another is surely hugely important as a way of averting or minimizing the risk of conflict. And the amount of time that's allowed now in order to deal with security crises on the peninsula is a dwindling asset. We saw that in the deployment of South Korean aircraft to the area close to North Korea in response to the satellite launch, which may in turn have been one of the proximate reasons why the North Koreans decided to launch these trial balloons, these propaganda balloons. And also the sense, perhaps, and again, this is speculative, right? Because it's so difficult to corroborate some of these pieces of evidence. But it seems as if, judging from the public statements coming out of North Korea, that one of the reasons Pyongyang sent all of these balloons across the DMZ was precisely because they felt that the political integrity of their own system was being challenged by South Korean NGOs and human rights organizations sending propaganda leaflets to the north. I don't think we should see that as just bluster. It may actually be quite important. Even someone as significant as Tae Yong-ho, the former North Korean official deputy ambassador in the UK, who's now a National Assembly representative in South Korea, has been on record saying sending these sorts of leaflets across the border is actually not a good idea. It may potentially foster rival groups in North Korea, but it's also likely to provoke a reaction from the North. So I think lowering the temperature when it comes to this war of words. Of course, it's the South that's come out recently and said we should be broadcasting propaganda statements to the DMZ. And it's interesting that the North Korean response to that has been to moderate its own position, which suggests to me that they do take these things very seriously. So if you like, test and verify, reinforce deterrence, make sure that you're able to make it clear that on the substantive issues of maintaining the integrity of your own country, South Korea will stand lockstep with the United States and its allies. But avoid the temptation to poke the tiger, the bear, whichever metaphor you want to use. Do not provoke North Korea at this time, because it's difficult to see what might come out of that situation, given what we've seen so far. So I think we need to reinforce deterrence and recognize that we do need a mechanism for talking to North Korea, which of course brings us back to the question of China. I think one of the very powerful reasons why the United States and Japan and South Korea have been reaching out to Beijing is that they see the Chinese as a interlocutor. How that's best done, whether China is going to play that role, is an open question, I think, at this stage.
Thank you, John. Ramon, do you have any what to add on these very complex? I understand it's very complex questions about the risks and any potential policy recommendations, what we can do to reduce the risks.
So I agree with the points that John has made. I would add a couple of points only here. The first one, I think the risk we might be thinking about as something plausible is a return to 2010, of course, when we saw the shelling of Yongbyon Island, sinking of Chonan, right, the South Korean, the ROK Navy ship. But I do agree that thinking about full-blown war is not really productive. I mean, I don't think that's very likely. And even in this case, there is a reason why this hasn't happened since 2010, right? Because that really elevated tensions in the Korean Peninsula very significantly. And I think that North Korea realizes this and that there is a risk of potential retaliation from the South, but also the deterrence mechanisms that South Korea has been developing in cooperation, especially, of course, with the US, but as John has mentioned, also with Japan, are there to actually try to prevent even something such as this, right? The shelling of Yongbyon that we saw, the sinking of the Cheonan. And the second point that I would make is that I think it is necessary to find a way to resume dialogue or at the very least contacts. I think it's positive that you see most, if not all, European countries that had embassies in Pyongyang thinking about going back. And yes, we know the challenges, North Korea being a bit recalcitrant to accept these European countries as opposed to China, Russia, or even Mongolia, but I think it's necessary to keep trying. I think that's in some European think tanks in contact with the embassies they deal with and potentially resuming dialogues. I think that also is important as well. And I think should be mentioned that the US is trying to reach out to North Korea in any way possible. They are really reaching out through many different interlocutors. It hasn't worked out. Seems that it's not going to be possible even in meetings in Mongolia or in Southeast Asia, never mind here in Europe. But I do think that showing a disposition to resume dialogue does matter, right? I don't think anything will happen before the upcoming US election, but after the US election, we'll see. North Korea may think that if Biden is reelected, that it cannot waste, so to speak, 4 more years waiting for the next US election, and it needs to try to have some sort of dialogue, even if it's at the track 1.5 level. And of course, if Trump wins, we have seen some former officials working under Trump who have said that they think that Trump will actually try to reach out to Kim Jong-un again. And in the South, it should be mentioned that President Yoon hasn't ruled out the possibility of dialogue with the North. He doesn't like the dialogue that President Moon had because he thinks he gave away too much for too little in return, but he hasn't said, I don't want to have a dialogue with the North. Under the right conditions, this may happen. And I think that if there is a US DPRK process, it would be very difficult for any South Korean president to be left out of this, right? So they would try to manage a way to have some sort of dialogue with the North, which I think the US would support. So in terms of suggestions that you were asking about, in my view, it is important to keep insisting in dialogue. And yes, sometimes we wonder, why do we have to be the supplicants to North Korea to resume dialogue? Well, I think because we need to show that we have the high moral ground, right? That we're trying to have a diplomatic process with North Korea, plus obviously the potential benefits of actually resuming the dialogue. That's why I've always been supportive of, the Swedish government supporting all these track 1.5, 2 dialogues, presence in Pyongyang, representing US interests there, because you may completely disagree with North Korea in all sorts of policy matters, nuclear issues, human rights, etc., but at least you can actually show that you are willing to talk even with countries with which you have fundamental differences. And I think this is important.
Thank you very much, Ramon, and thank you, John. I'm really grateful for both of you that accepted the invitation to join, and you kickstarted this series of strategic talks. And I think all of us that has been participating and listening today do realize how many complex and challenging issues do exist, and 1 hour to discuss those is definitely not enough, but at least we have scratched on the surface and we have identified some of them and been able to explore some of the perspective and issues around. So thank you once more, really well. I'd like to remind before I close that on the 19th we will have 2 US experts, Frank Ohm and Heino Klink, joining me for a similar discussion on the same type of questions. And the day after, on the 20th, it will be Lieutenant General Chunimboom and Professor Lee, also discussing the same time. So you are welcome to join us for those events as well. They will be advertised on our webpage, so please join us. So once more, John and Ramon, thank you very, very much for joining us, and thank you to our viewers, and see you on the 19th, hopefully. Bye-bye, and thanks for today.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.